Welcome to this panel called No, Let's Go That Way. Can we use social imagination to change the trajectory of shared transportation? And I welcome you back to the final 2 hours of the Big Shift, the 2021 National Shared Mobility Summit. We're really glad you're here. I'm Benjie de la Peña. For the benefit of those who are our participants who are visually impaired, let me describe how I appear on the screen. I'm a middle-aged Asian man with brown skin and short black hair. I'm wearing black rim glasses and a white shirt. And with me today I'm excited about this conversation. And if you don't stop us, we could go on for more than 3 hours. So I'm gonna have to pay attention to the time. Two people who think a lot about the future, think a lot about how the future should be and how do we get there, and all of the forces driving the future, right? And technology. So we have Radha Mistry, who is the Foresight practice leader for strategic foresight in Autodesk, and Bryan, who is the director of the Bachelor of Science in Urban Technology program, and assistant professor of practice in architecture at the University of Michigan. So they're both design practitioners. And I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment, but about this panel is really, if you look back, the canonical Futurama, 1939 New York World's Fair, presented a vision of the future that supposedly changed the people's imagination about automobility. And 100 years since, we kind of say, yeah, maybe it did. But there have been many visions of alternative transportation futures and scenarios presented over the years. None of them seems to have stuck. And so we'll talk about that and talk about, how does this sector talk in ways that actually capture people's imaginations and not just the imagination of urban and transportation planners. So let me turn to my panelists and let them describe themselves and introduce themselves. Radha?
Thank you, Benjie. My name is Radha Mistry. To visually describe myself, I'm a mid-30s woman of Indian descent with long black hair, and I'm wearing a black overalls with a white t-shirt underneath. And Benjie, what else can I kind of say? Should I share a little bit about my background?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm trained as an architect and have spent a little bit over the last decade really focusing on the practice of foresight and thinking really about emerging technologies and how that will change the way that we will design and make things, and how that really impacts the way that human beings will operate within our cities, within our workplaces, where we play, where we eat, where we, our retail spaces, wherever it is that human beings are interacting. Those are the spaces that I'm kind of thinking about.
Cool. Bryan?
Hi, my name is Bryan Boyer. I am a 40-year-old white guy with white-ish glasses that are new and a black shirt, and I'm sitting inside a modernist box, which is my comfy place. And I also have a background in design, but actually before I started my career in design, I worked in technology in Silicon Valley. And after studying design, I went and worked inside government on public sector innovation. So my work is kind of a mix of technology, place, and institution. And fundamentally, I think that if we want to be aggressive with the future, all three of those factors have to be in play.
And with that framing and segue, right, I go back to that question I posed when I was introducing the panel. It's like, there was Futurama, and with the benefit of hindsight, maybe it's a little bit been amplified, but it was a moment where people looked at the future and said, "Oh, shiny cars with fins," and that then dryers and dishwashers at home, and all this very shiny future on highways. And after that, right, we build out this thing, this big infrastructure that delivers cars and moves people, with all of its problems built up on racism and inherently inequitable policies, right? And along the way, a whole bunch of advocates and people who are thinking about the environment, people who are thinking about social justice, are saying we need to have an alternate vision, but nothing has stuck. What do you guys think? Why is that?
I think part of it is a lot of the future visions that we've historically led with are based in technological advancement and kind of the dazzle of technology. And we don't always do the foresight work to think about, well, what are the cultural norms and behaviors that need to kind of move forward in the same way that technology is advancing to truly take advantage of the technology in a manner that benefits society, right? So we're kind of, oftentimes, and I find this a lot, even now I'm currently based in LA, but I work for a company that's based in Silicon Valley. And a lot of it is, we kind of fetishize the technology and are kind of taken by the dazzle and the shine and the promise of it. And then the other piece of it is, who is creating the visions and who are they preferable for? And that's a question that I think we need to be asking ourselves. And I don't know if we always do. And I think that's where that equitable piece comes in, is when I'm thinking about this vision of the future, who is it truly serving? Who's designing the business models? Who's putting together the policy structures? And, when it comes to ease and security and convenience, by whose definition are we actually kind of moving forward?
Bryan, you want to react to that? And I'll come back, Radha, because this is very intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, I think another aspect of it, Benjie, is if we use Futurama as the example, that wasn't a transit conversation, right? That was looking at the future broadly, the future of American life, if you will. And it has all of the qualifications that Radha mentioned, right? It was an incomplete version of the future, but I think it's telling that we weren't talking about how are we going to move, it was how are we going to live. And to some extent, it feels to me that the conversations now that happen that are future oriented are deep in some silo, right? So we see a corporation represent the future of its industry with a little bit of dazzle on the edges, maybe, of things that touch the life of children or other stakeholders, but it's pretty focused. And so somehow it feels like the visioning inside the box of a silo or of an organization and their responsibility is one of the things that's a bit of a barrier for us, because we know that mobility is never just about moving. It's also about where you're moving to, where you're moving from, who you are that's moving. And those have to have room as well in the visioning process.
So I'll pursue that for both of you. And Radha, particularly, you talked about their visions, but they don't have foresight. If you want to split that up for us, and maybe a little bit of a directive for transportation geeks like myself, where it's like, and I see what you're saying, it's like, oh, it's the AV. 5 years ago, it was going to be the AV tomorrow, and then it was going to be the Hyperloop and all of these little technologies, or maybe it's the aerial taxis. But it's not, as Bryan was saying, it's like, it's not a vision of life, it's a vision of technology. So what's that foresight and vision thing?
Well, I'll give you an architectural example, because that's definitely kind of my wheelhouse. But oftentimes when we're designing buildings or thinking about the built environment, that is a visioning of the future. You are putting a machine in the ground. It will serve a particular purpose, particular occupants, particular programmatic elements. But the thing is that building is going to then be around for 50, maybe 100 years, depending on your zoning laws or, the city that you're based in. And the thing we don't always think about is we'll think about the maintenance of that building. We'll think about, ensuring that it hits all of your programmatic cues for your client. What we don't always think about is, well, what's the world going to look like 50 to 100 years from then, from once post-construction? How are people going to change? What's the landscape of the city going to look like? What other things are going to operate in this ecosystem within which I have now placed this building? And so the building itself becomes this future artifact, right? And so we don't always say, once the thing is there, once the vision has manifested in some manner, what comes next? What does this mean?
Yeah.
Because half the battle is getting it actually to, getting it out there in the first place.
So it's that we tend to think of objects in space and not objects in time, which interestingly, there was a report 3 years ago of a new state of matter called time crystals, which is that occurred to me. But it's interesting because just part of that conversation, because you mentioned maintenance, Nicholas de Monshaw, who heads MIT's architecture department, I guess, was talking to me about when they were designing, and he took a tour of the Apple new headquarters, And what occurred to him was that the walls were sloping inside too. And what occurred to him was, for whoever was mopping that floor, where do they stop mopping? Right up the wall. So it was really interesting. But I like this. We think of the object, but we don't think of the context of that object in the future. Bryan, I know in your work this is also so important, right? It's not the technology, but how does technology apply here and now, and what's the feedback loop it creates?
I mean, I have really mixed feelings about this question, actually, because on the one, so if we're in a conversation with people who are more technologically inclined, then maintenance, I think, to Radha's point, becomes a very important layer of practicality, layer of foresight. It's a way to situate those ideas in a lived future rather than just some kind of abstract future. On the other hand, maintenance is a fungible process. So whatever we create will need to be maintained or likely need to be maintained. But that doesn't mean that the techniques that we use now for caring for the world need to be used in the future, right? Some things that we do now don't need to be continued. Some things that we aren't doing now need to be restarted and perpetuated. And so I find that it's kind of a mixed bag, because I don't want, for instance, if I think about community meetings that I've been to here in Detroit related to, there's a Highway 375 that's like a block or two that way that's going to be brought up to grade from a sunken highway. And it destroyed the African-American neighborhood of Detroit. Hugely important to repair it. But some of the concerns around, for instance, clearing the snow on the new boulevard are being used, in my understanding, to keep it a very wide boulevard that I think is going to be counterproductive to kind of restorative goals, or the potential for restoration as part of that initiative, right? And so I think maintenance needs to be in play, I guess is a long way to put that, because otherwise it can be used as kind of bludgeon for maintaining the status quo in a manner that's not positive.
Well, exactly what you're saying, right? That the logic of the current mobility system propels itself because it's maintained to propel itself, right? And to continue going. And having worked in a city department of transportation, part of the question on bike lanes was, well, how are we going to plow it, right? Because we don't have the plows that can handle the small bike lane. Or, turning radii are always, well, how are the fire trucks going to turn when it's too sharp? Which is like, well, you could change the fire truck size, but we're not going to do that. But sorry, Radha, were you going to pipe in with?
No, go for it.
So these elements of living in the future and thinking about how do we maintain it. Here's a question going back to shared mobility, the very general statement, and I'll get to whether that's what we should be calling it, right? So another word, right, or set of words. But what do you see now? Is there anything in the system that cares for shared mobility, so that it then becomes something that other people use? Why is that not, apart from the people who get to use it, it's still a very small segment of society. Why is it not a creature of our imagination? Why can't we think about how we will live, or most people will not think about how they will live related to shared mobility, but they can think about how they will live related to, well, the next car I'm going to get. Is that a big question?
I mean, you're speaking with somebody sitting in Detroit, home of the automobile.
Right, and Los Angeles.
Somebody sitting in Los Angeles, playground of the automobile.
Home of the freeway.
Right. Well, here's something that one of our panelists, Adonia Lugo, had mentioned. She said, when we think about a vision for the future for sustainable and equitable future in transportation, we need to involve everyone, and that includes, in LA, people in the car culture. What's in it for them?
Yeah.
Right.
And
but go ahead.
Well, and I was just going to say, I think part of it is because, I've had the privilege of living in a lot of different cities in a lot of different parts of the world, and I prefer public transportation. But living in, and I used to live in the Bay Area, and as much as the BART system and the Muni system have its, have their quirks. It got me to where I needed to be, and I was able to kind of, walk the last mile or whatever it was. In a place like, for example, Los Angeles, that becomes a little bit more difficult because the city has been designed not for the pedestrian, but for cars. Right. And the impetus for that didn't come from the citizen. It came from perhaps like transportation planners or car manufacturers or urban planners or, whoever else had, or developers who had some kind of an economic interest in this city in a way that didn't necessarily benefit the person, the human being. And so for me, it's like, I would love to be able to walk down the street to my local grocery store. I would love to feel safe, in a few months, taking my kid in a stroller down the street or whatever. That's not necessarily the case, right? My grocery store is an 8-minute drive. All of the amenities, and we live in an area that's not deemed a food desert. We live in an area that is, by LA standards, pretty central and highly accessible. And so, but the walk to the metro station is 15 minutes. And so it's, who are these systems being designed for? And it's not just, I think the issue about mobility is it's part of a more complex picture, right? So it's not just about the systems that move people and goods and services through the city. It's all of the things on the periphery of that. And untangling all of those other elements becomes a little bit interesting, because then you're getting folks at the table who you might not bring to the table typically.
I think for me, there's also a question of the priorities, right? So like one of the games I try to play is, when there's something you disagree with, just for a minute, assume the best intentions in the design of that system. So like, I personally don't think, and to be clear, I don't think, Radha, you were implying this, but I don't think like a bunch of evil people sat down and designed Los Angeles to be a car paradise, right? Like, it was a good idea at the time for the people who were making those decisions. We know that there were people who were left out of those decisions. We know that they didn't have the proper foresight, but it wasn't a stupid thing, or it wasn't the stupidest thing. So if we allow ourselves that, then what is to enable us today to make good decisions without leaving something out of the equation, right? And so I think what that comes to is like, what are we trying to accomplish, or what are the goals of the system? And so, for instance, in the highway process that I mentioned, it was very clear from the start, it was a DOT process. So it was about car throughput. And I fundamentally disagree with that as the goal of making I don't even remember the total, but a multi-million-dollar investment in the public realm, right? That's one of many, many goals, including walking and biking and lower rates of asthma and other things. So to come back to this, then I kind of have a counterfactual, like alternate history, which is another way that I like to think about these kinds of things. So if instant delivery from bots and drones and everything else had happened right after World War II, instead of suburbanization, would suburbanization have happened? Like at the time, it made sense because the grocery store that you wanted to go to, or the toy store, whatever it was far away. You didn't have any alternatives. The delivery infrastructure wasn't strong enough. But now it's possible to imagine a world where it's actually not so easy to move personally, but it's very easy for the goods to move. And so I wonder if the conversation about individual mobility as separate and distinct from the mobility of goods is also a challenging dimension here.
I like the point you're making, although I wonder about the proposition of maybe suburbs wouldn't have happened because there was also, apart from the ability to move faster, right?
Lots of other reasons.
Right, racist, unequal view of who should live where, which then goes back to Radha's framing of how should we live.
And military objectives, right? I mean, there's like a lot of layers that are left out of that, for sure.
Yeah. Well, someone else on the panel made that point about what the automobility personal mobility by car infrastructure is so omnipresent, right? You see it. And so that tells you that's the way to move. And shared mobility is so virtual, right? It's on your phone and you'll access it by some service. Talk to me about that, and how could it really just be virtual, or do we need to figure out a way to make it in IRL, in real life, right? And be touchable and something more than just bus stops?
You can go ahead, Bryan.
I mean, again,
it's speculative, right?
I'm not trying to occupy both sides of every question you bring up, Benjie, but I've certainly done a lot of work trying to make alternatives visible in the city. If you can't see it, you can't be it, you can't imagine it, right? So I think there's a lot of effort that needs to go into that. But then I guess the thing that is causing me to pause is, like, if I imagine the rise of Amazon as a bizarro alternative to the public library, like, the libraries were around and very visible, actually, in many American neighborhoods. Again, not all, but many.
Yeah, a billionaire decided to spend on libraries instead of going to space, I guess, is the thing.
Well, and in fact, that's why we have a lot of those libraries.
Right.
Yeah.
But so, that would tell me that visibility is not the only factor here. And I think part of it, you were talking before the session actually started about what's an alternative term for shared mobility or shared use. And I think that those questions of what we call things and how we're describing them to ourselves, they're deceptively simple, because they are so important at the end of the day. Like, if I think about the mythology of the vehicle, and sitting here again in Detroit, it's hyper present because the industry is here also, right? Not just the car companies, but all the marketing firms and the photographers and the copywriters and all those people that go into the process of making cars this desirable object. That's been a story of freedom. So if we're talking about moving to shared formats, then that's an erosion of freedom, which I don't think anybody wants. So I think we need to find a way to talk about stuff in a framework that doesn't, like, pit it against those aspects of American identity that are going to be very difficult.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Bryan, but so this is the thing that's really interesting to me here is, what are the implications across a generational spectrum? Because I remember being 15 years old and I could not wait to get my driver's license, right? I couldn't wait to, my parents didn't buy me a car. I wasn't allowed to have one, but I could borrow theirs, right? And that was that piece of freedom. And I think even for my parents, when they came to this country, having your first car was a really big deal, because then it meant you could explore the area around you. You could easily get to work. You could do all of these other things that, weren't accessible to you initially. When I look at, some of the students that I teach, or like the kids who are coming out of high school, it doesn't seem like that same desire for the car is there, because they have their phones, they have access to Uber and Lyft and whatever else it might be. They have access to, they're able to kind of navigate the city and get through the city with, the scooters that we see and the bikes that are out there and things like that. And so I'm wondering if this piece about adoption and kind of, seeing shared mobility in the public narrative will happen maybe naturally in this next generation, who have grown up as kind of digital natives, who have had to kind of bridge that space between the in real life city around them and the way technology allows them to navigate the spaces around them.
Fascinating, because it is this generation, right, where our generation was, oh, we'll drive to the fast food store, right, or the fast food joint. This is a generation that, at least in the last year, say, oh, well, bring up an app and order something, right? And how does that affect how they see movement in the world and where they need to move to? Radha, you've spent a lot of time thinking about, talking to young people and thinking about the future. is there anything you can share about what you're hearing from, or what is fascinating you about the way they're conducting themselves in the world and what they're thinking about? I famously remember the opening essay in Stuart Brand's The Clock of the Long Now. And it was Danny Hillis saying that, in the 80s, if you ask people, or in the 70s or 60s, when you ask people what was the future, it was 1984. In the 80s, you asked them, it was like the year 2000. And the vision of when the future was getting shorter and shorter and shorter, right? And so it was not, millennia away, but is the next generation still thinking about future in a way? And how will if they are, how do we plug into that or listen to it? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that I know exactly what the next generation is thinking, and but I do think that I think their view of the future is a little bit more expansive because they have access to other parts of the world, right, through their devices. And again, the caveat here is it's the folks who have access to devices and have access to bandwidth and have access to that kind of technology. But the future, kind of the vision of, there was this program on the BBC about 50 years ago where they asked children, I think age like 7 to about 12 or 13, what do they think the future is going to look like? And one person said, I can imagine myself going to a funeral for a robot and having a meal with just pills. And I don't want that future, but I can see that future coming true. I think because the rate of technological advancement has been so fast, at least for those of us who didn't grow up with that from kind of day one. Kids these days, I'm not that old, but I'm going to say kids these days, it's like, it's that rate of technological advancement is kind of the norm. And I feel like they're just easily kind of picking up the next leap and the next leap and the next leap, right, and almost becoming the digital Sherpas for those of us who are sitting there going, well, wait a minute, what just happened and what does this mean?
Right.
Right. So I think they're a lot more fluent in the language of the future, but it doesn't feel so jarring. And part of that is, and I see this a lot even with, kind of teaching kids speculative design and foresight and things like that. The younger folks are, the easier it is for them to kind of imagine what might be. And it's not scary. It's, it tends to be a little bit more whimsical and wonderful. But it is also very much based in the technologies that they're already experiencing, because a lot of these folks are, early adopters.
Bryan, did you want to add to that?
Well, as you were speaking, Radha, I was trying to imagine what was the pace of change during our childhoods of new bus depots, new neighborhoods, new waterfronts, etc. And how does that compare to now? Because I think you're correct that the kind of pace of purely digital change, right? So like the vector of new face filters on Instagram, insane.
Oh yeah, exponential.
But then when I think about, projects like a new subway in New York that take 20 years, so, by the time the kid grows up and goes to college, like that project's just getting going. Like there's a disconnect there. And so I would like to know more about what that kind of inspires in the brain. But having just gone through admissions for the new Bachelor of Science in Urban Technology, I can tell you one of the things that I'm excited about from having a tiny view into the minds of the 20 students who will join us is that they're very adept at saying, this is a challenge that I see, like public transit doesn't work as well as it could. And there's this other thing over here that I think is part of the answer that might look separate and distinct, but actually could be related, right? So like, I'm going to use data to help solve a problem that I perceive with buses. And just alone that like ability to make cross connections for me is really exciting, because it means that we'll have ideas and approaches that are, again, kind of between the silos or completely outside of the silos that are also normal to us.
Interesting, because I was just thinking of the succession of apps in the last, I would say, 5 years, right? It was Vine, and then it was Snapchat, and then something else, and now it's TikTok, and I can barely keep up with it. The above 40 that I am, or 50, it's like, oh, Facebook, I'm barely using it, but they seem to be very, very adaptable to it. So we've got 15 minutes, but I'm gonna start asking for more advice from you guys. For you're looking at this community of transportation advocates and transportation planners and people in the cities trying to change the system, advocates for policy at the federal level and state level. And we're all kind of like putting little pieces on and saying it's micromobility, it's shared mobility, and not capturing imagination. As practitioners who deal with, thinking about a vision for the future and how do we get there, what would and I'm gonna open up to Q&A, but what would your advice be for all of us to say, hey, you have to stop doing this and start doing this, or start doing this and do more of that? What would that be?
I have just a couple, and one of the really big ones, and this isn't to say that folks aren't already doing this, but one of the really big ones is to continue to ask ourselves, who is this preferable for, and who are we leaving behind? Right? And that doesn't mean it's intentional. It just means we acknowledge this, and we might say, and I get this a lot in the technology space, in the discourse around automation, we know we are leaving people behind. And that is the nature of what automation is doing to the industries that we serve. But I think the acknowledgement of that and the understanding of what that means for society as we move forward becomes really important. And then I think the second piece is looking at the system as kind of an intersection between the technological advancement piece, the design of the built environment kind of spaces that we're looking at, and then also the societal and cultural norms, that human behavior and cognition piece that can be designed or can at least be addressed in some meaningful way, right? So just because the technology is there, or just because we've put a really great new transit system in a city, doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to opt in, because maybe they don't know how, or maybe it's not, they're not ready for it, or whatever it might be. So I feel like those three kind of elements need to be designed intentionally together to be able to kind of move towards something where people are being trusted, and there's kind of trust in that sense of community, where we're getting something meaningful.
Bryan?
Yeah, that last piece, the kind of, to use like business terms, the marketing of systems that are built in the public interest, I think is hugely undervalued still. And it tells, because when we see like an article of the 12 awesome visual identities of blah, 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 the Olympics, for instance, they're all Olympics way in the past, or the 12 coolest liveries of public transit, like they're all very old, they're not new ones. So I think owning the kind of the total experience sounds frivolous, but actually is part of pulling the motivation and creating the space in an individual mind to imagine an alternative possibility that they can participate in. And the other thing I would add is, to the extent that you can prototype or build some new possibility, to do it in a way that is holistic, right? So like the smallest thing executed really, really well versus a citywide system that is kind of hodgepodge and doesn't really operate, right? Because if you have like little parts of it, but it's citywide, I get it, you're serving a lot of people, and that's, I think, what drives probably everyone on this call. But on the flip side of it, it makes it very difficult for the layperson or just the average writer or user to imagine what that system looks like when it flourishes. Whereas if you see a very narrow slice and you're like, wow, this is totally amazing, and it's only for people going to and from the library, then you can imagine, oh, well, what if this was how everybody moved in the city, right? So that like change in the dimensionality of the future visioning, I think, is important here as well.
And I think that also allows for those kind of incremental iterations as you're going forward, right? Because then you're learning from how people are interacting with that new thing, how it might need to adapt over time. And this is where that maintenance kind of piece comes in. It's not necessarily about maintaining the status quo. It's about adapting to a changing environment in a way that serves the needs of the people and the goods and the services that need to move through the city.
I'd summarize that as learning, right? You try something
Right.
and then you're learning from it. So Bryan and I share this fascination with a book and a writer named Douglas Allen. He wrote a book called The Institutional Revolution. And it's that, you know, as the Industrial Revolution went along, institutions also innovated and changed to be able to do that. And in transportation, I like citing that, well, first there were just street sweepers. Then we had to build up side pavement, right? Because those were getting heavier. And then we had to get signs of pavement. And then we had to build out sidewalks because, you know, you didn't want people walking through poop. And then we added, you know, the stoplights, and then we created disciplines, right? As they go, as more and more of this system got built out. So on a speculative note, since you were both pretty good at this, if you were going to create, and I say this having been part of a wave of people in agencies who are like, you are the chief of innovation, or here's the innovation unit, right? It's like all of that in transportation. The Office of Extraordinary Innovation, I think, was what San Francisco had, right? But if you were going to create an office or a title or a unit in a public agency that would be thinking about the future of transportation, what would that title be? And conversely, if you were going to create an office, and you know the private companies have public affairs, government relations, if you were going to create an office in private companies that would be thinking about the future, but with kind of what's their responsibility to the public, what are those? I mean, so speculative question from both of you.
I mean, I would answer the first one is kindergarten, and the second one is the board of directors.
Explain.
In that, I mean, this is kind of it's an annoying answer to your question, Benjie, but I think the future is not something that can kind of sit in a team somewhere, right? Like, obviously it can. In fact, Radha runs a whole team that does that work. But if we really want to imagine it having a pervasive effect across an organization, then it needs to be something that everybody inside that organization participates in. And so, you know, that looks like a horizontal function of some kind. And the most horizontal learning function that we have in our society is kindergarten or elementary school. So I would like to start at the ground floor.
Okay. So we should be teaching mobility and transportation to kindergartners. I'm just kidding. But you know, there is that study that said that the kids who walk to school saw more of their city and could map it out.
That's interesting. No, but that's really interesting because, like, you know, when I was a kid and I went to school in India as a, you know, like elementary school very early on, it was not a weird thing to walk to school or sit in an auto rickshaw with, you know, 5 other people from the same building that you were in, and as opposed to like a school bus, which just wasn't really a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I think it's like, how do we, whereas for when I moved here, the aspiration was you're going to get a car when you're 16 and that's the cool thing, right? But imagine if, as I had been going through even my educational system, it wasn't about driver's ed, it was about mobility through the city. And that was the education that I was being kind of given. So I do think that's kind of interesting, is like starting at the ground level, Bryan, and setting up what should we aspire to as the optimal mobility experience, because you're being fed different things based on where you're living, or, you know, what you're being taught in school or at home. And I think it does come down to that.
I really like that. And I really like the kindergarten versus, one is oversight and kind of leadership. The other one is everyone should understand this and get to experience it on both sides. I've got a few questions on the Q&A. Paul Salama asks, right, is it possible to frame public processes around goals versus like just saying an alternative vision? And I'm just going to react to that and say, I thought that's what we did all the time. but with relative, I don't know how relatively effective it is. But Bryan, do you want to react to that? Or
Well, I mean, if I just reflect on the highway process that I was part of here, there were people who raised their hands and said, moving cars through this strip of former highway is not the most important thing to us.
Yeah.
And the responses were the DOT. So I think, what Paul's getting at is, to use the word of the recent discussion, like that is an aspiration, right? To be able to focus truly and fundamentally on goals,
right.
Whatever goals the community that's relevant brings to the table. I think the question is whether a government that's organized through silos can accomplish that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue it's quite difficult in a lot of cases because it makes accountability. You show up at that meeting and say, okay, this is what we want to do. And they say, oh, that's not, we don't have any authority to act there. And we're not accountable for that. We don't have expertise there. Mm-hmm. So it's quite a hard thing to operationalize, even though I think the idea is a very important one.
Related to that, someone just asked, Mehul Malhotra just asked, what do you think is it that makes something, let's say a public service, truly aspirational for people? Is aspiration the feeling we should even aim for as a society versus the whole, it's a goal, so we're fulfilling what we're supposed to achieve in that thing versus the whole, let's aspire for something. And when I think about that, right, isn't autonomous vehicles aspirational in many ways? Although if you own a Tesla, I suppose you can pay the $200 a month for it. So let me reframe that and say, how do we get people to aspire for a different future?
I think part of it is is kind of like the value proposition that you're being given, right? So again, with the autonomous vehicle thing, it's saying there's this thing around convenience, around ease of use, around security. You can multitask in your car while you are being driven from home to office. You don't necessarily have to own your own vehicle. It can be part of a fleet of vehicles. Imagine not being tethered, right? And so I think it's what are the values that we are being that we value, and that we are kind of being fed to say these are the marks of a really good life that keeps me safe and healthy and nourished in whatever way. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the AV though. Like you can say a really healthy life is that I can take my bike down to the grocery store or take my kids to nursery or whatever it is easily. I know that my bike's not going to get stolen. I know that the sidewalks are going to work. I know that the bike lanes are easily accessible. Mm-hmm. I understand how to navigate through the city, right? And so the aspiration piece again comes with the expectations that we're setting and kind of the story that we're feeding people about what is good for them. Not to say that citizens are kind of like, mindless like minions, but to say the stories we tell about the future have a very big role in shaping what people believe is good and what is not good.
Bryan?
Yeah, I guess I keep trying to think of like what's the right way to try to frame this to say mobility is not the most important thing, but there I just said it. It's not the most
that's it.
To me. And maybe one of the ways that I might try to think about it is what are the number of times per day that you feel coerced into making choices by the facts of the city in which you live, right? So if I want to go to a grocery store that has good organic produce, I am coerced into taking a car or taking a very circuitous bus route. The city is not built in a way that I can walk to that grocery store easily, right? And so I would argue that what we want for a city is a place where the minimum number of people feel coerced the minimum number of times on a daily basis, right? Which that's talking about the baseline rather than the aspiration. And then, of course, if you want to bike instead of walk, if you want to take a kayak instead of walk, whatever it is, go for it. but you
Mm.
shouldn't be put in a situation where you are forced to use a car. And that obviously is a generation scale kind of change in the American context. But I would want to look at metrics like that as a way to understand kind of our relative progress.
Well, this has been really, really fascinating. We've gone a bit over time, but thank you. And I want to catch you for coffee when the new baby comes, and then we'll sit around and maybe meet the rest of these people. Participants, join us for the wrap up of the whole conference immediately after this, and we'll celebrate a bit. Thank you so much, Bryan. Thank you so much, Radha.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye.